So let's first talk about your job. What is it that you actually do on a sort of day-to-day basis?
Looking outside the journal, I have responsibilities for clinical pharmacology toxicology service, which is very variable, the number of consults I get. We also look after, I personally do my own research in phase 1 oncology, that is taking new drugs into oncology patients. So I have my own oncology clinic and run a number of studies, both which are sponsored by pharma, but also that are part of the NCI sponsored studies. So that's my research. I also run a lab, and for my sins, I am also the medical director of the clinical trials office, which probably brings more grief than anything else. But just to top it off, because I haven't got anything else to do in my spare time, I sort of handle papers and manuscripts for the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology that come from the Americas region.
It's my understanding, right, that your BJCP international editorship is ending?
Yeah, so I've been privileged and fortunate enough now to do this for 9 years. My successor is going to be Dave Flockhart, who is going to take over as the senior editor in America.
So for the role of an international editor, what do you actually do? What does that entail?
So the system of peer review takes on a sort of paradigm that I think is fairly commonplace throughout many journals. The submitted articles are triaged by our administrative assistant in the journal, depending on the geographical area from which they emanate, and then the senior editor first takes the first look at them, makes a judgment as to whether the material is innovative, is adding to the field, and if that judgment is made, we then sort of assign an executive editor who looks for reviewers to peer review the article, and those processes of peer review and the reports go back to the executive editor, which then finally comes to the senior editor, who makes a final recommendation on publication, and that is communicated from the senior editor to the authors, usually via email.
So the papers come to you then from the senior editor?
The paper comes from the editorial assistant to the senior editor, and then the senior editor reviews it, sort of what he thinks is relevant and or not, can actually reject it there and then if it does perhaps as material that's beyond the scope of the journal, for example, which is sort of animal pharmacology. But if you accept that it's got material that you think is interesting and innovative, you then pass it on to an executive editor who usually has expertise in the area of the manuscript, and then that individual will define the reviewers for the peer review process.
So how do you think that reviewers are actually identified? How does that typically happen?
The identification of reviewers, we have a large database of reviewers, usually that consists of people who either have reviewed previously or have authored papers previously or are recognized experts in the field. People who are interested in reviewing for the journal can approach this in a number of ways. I personally have had a number of emails from people who are not currently or were not at the time currently reviewing. They expressed an interest in reviewing, but also in a very helpful way included their CV, just to give their senior editor a review of what their background was, what their expertise was. And then if we think it's appropriate, we add them to our review database, and they're assigned there with their keywords, and the reviewer will be picked on depending on what the paper is, what the exec editor thinks. And sometimes we tend to sort of use new reviewers in combination with more senior reviewers so that we can get a feel for the expertise of a new reviewer.
Absolutely. And so if I were interested and I wanted to start reviewing for BJCP, would I contact the editor that's in my region?
Yeah, I think it would be definitely a positive thing to do, or the right way from process point of view is to, if for example, if you're in Sydney, to contact Dr. Samogi. If you're on the other hand, if you're in San Francisco, contacting me would be, or my successor in the Americas would be the right thing to do. And then it really is a matter of just seeing if the individual is appropriately qualified and also got a sort of hunger for wanting to do the review process.
So you've been with BJCP for 9 years, which is unusual, right? So maybe you could tell us a little bit of over the years, have you seen it change in terms of the papers that are being submitted or the ones that are being accepted, and how that change is really?
Yes, I think. Well, let's take how it's changed a little. The first big change that I think has occurred is that the society and the editors and the team leaders of the BJCP, in sync with the sister journal, have recognized that both from an educational role, but also from a role of more global acceptance, we've started to encourage applications or submissions of papers from a broader geographical base as possible. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we've also similarly undertaken a strong campaign of trying to encourage and obtain high quality reviews that speak to topic areas. And I think the last year we've had topics of nutraceuticals, prescribing in chronic kidney disease, not recent advances in cancer chemotherapy, are 3 or so of the themed areas that we've touched on. And I know from the editorial board we have a number of planned themed issues coming forward in 2014.
Well, from a perspective that I read those, I find those to be very helpful, right? Because they give you a very broad look at sort of what's happening right now.
What's happening in the field, yeah. And that's what we've attempted to do, is to, in addition to the reviews, and it's not to the exclusion of original articles, the goal is to have perhaps a high proportion of the issue contain reviews, but then we supplement it with appropriate focus area original manuscripts, which I think then makes a nice bundle for a themed issue on a particular topic.
I think those are really important too from an educational value, right? Because you can show students who are coming into your program, here's a great review that you could read, and here's an article that shows the application of that.
Yeah. I think the other step I'd say that there's been a change is that I think we've sort of moved away, if you like, from, I'm not going to call it the old firm pharmacology, but we've moved into an era of promoting people to undertake studies and submit them to us that are not just PK observation studies. I think we've moved to more looking at the PK-PD relationships and trying to tease apart mechanisms. So we're working in the translational realm of and better understanding of drug action in humans.
And I would say pharmacogenomics too, wouldn't you say?
True, yeah, I think you've got to add that in. But you don't always get pharmacogenomics, PK and PD. But
in the same paper.
In the same paper.
No.
but that maybe, going forward, I can see that certainly being a paradigm that's going to be something that we'd like to see, definitely.
When you think of clinical pharmacology, right, you've been doing this for quite a number of years. How has the field itself changed, and where do you see it going? I
really got into clinical pharmacology in the 1980s. And have been in it since then, and have veered towards cancer chemotherapy. I think clin pharm as a discipline is the discipline par excellence for translational medicine, and I think there's beginning to be a recognition about that within both the authorities, the grant-giving bodies. And the reason I say that is that, in part, the recent US initiative from the NCRR about their Clinical Translational Science Awards have changed those awards, and they actually specifically mention teams and studies that are related to clinical pharmacology. So there's a recognition that this discipline is really a translational discipline. And I think that's one of the most important aspects, that I think it was recognized as such, certainly by many of the practitioners, but I don't think, shall we say, the authorities and the grant-giving bodies were so easily recognizing it previously. So I think that's one thing that's changed. I think we've gone from a sort of observational group and looking at the sort of mechanistic aspects of drugs, linking it to PD, and are now with the genetic revolution from sort of 2000 on or thereabouts, with the publication of the human genome sequences. I think we now have the facility to link all of those things, and I think that's an incredibly powerful set of tools around therapeutics.
So Lionel, can you tell me what your vision is for clinical pharmacology?
I actually think that I think the vision of where we want to go is to ultimately be the leaders in optimizing patient care around drugs and understanding it so that we can articulate this and change therapeutic prescribing practice. However, what I'd like to say is that for hundreds of years, even since the 18th century, there have been people who have been thinking this way. So that I don't think this is a new vision. Individualization and optimizing therapeutics is not something new, because William Withering did it in the 1790s. So all I think we've got is, I think we've got enhanced tools to allow us to do this to a different level, with our PK, our PD, and our pharmacogenetics, and you put this all together, and I really think we can make some differences going forward. And these differences are not just in positive patient outcomes. They're actually in reducing negative outcomes and thinking about costs as well. So the whole thing together, I think, is the way forward.
Well, so much of pharmacogenomics was really about, right, the adverse events, right?
Right.
Not just about having a better drug for a
Right.
patient,
Right.
but it's making a patient who's being given a prescribed drug at the prescribed dose doesn't have
An adverse outcome.
an adverse outcome
Right.
with that.
But I mean, we should be thinking the other side of it as well, which is, so maybe it's the choice of the right drug in the right patient that has the best outcome. So both ends of that spectrum are appropriate to perform at the highest possible level, avoid the negative while enhancing the positive.